It's my honor to introduce Ken Getz, and Craig Lipset is going to be joining Ken, and they're going to be presenting on a case for pharma playing an integral role in bridging clinical research and healthcare.
Great, thank you, Joan. I'm really delighted to be accompanied by my colleague and friend, Craig Lipset. We wish Joe were here to join us as well, but we'll do our best. And thank you, everybody who's really stuck it out. As you know, no conference would be complete without us looking at some of the data that really articulates the perennial challenges and chronic challenges that we've dealt with for decades. And so I'm going to sort of start there, but with an important caveat, and that is, again, this is sort of an important way for us to characterize at a macro level the business imperative for industry to support the convergence of clinical research and clinical care. And you don't have to look far to find so many of the metrics, and we've alluded to many of them. We've touched on so many of them throughout the meeting. And I'm just going to be providing some data points that really articulate with metrics why we have a business imperative to do so. This is a simplification, but it's based on years of research that we've conducted at the Tufts Center. And the key takeaway here is that the two primary funders of clinical research are very much in a kind of a symbiotic or complementary relationship. Of the nearly $200 billion that flows into R&D, the primary funder of basic research is really government, and the primary funder of clinical trials, most notably of medical interventions, is really industry. And there's a lot of data, though, that documents the complementary way that the parties really assist each other, particularly during the translational research phase. And that has historically been one of the critical ways that we can take what is learned in clinical research and then translate it into clinical practice. The other key translational area is to go from basic research and animal model studies into our human testing. And those have typically been regarded as the two translational blocks. The largest block is really the translation of clinical research into clinical care. Someone had asked earlier, I think Norm might have even posed it as a question, but does anybody know how productive we are as an industry? Are we as productive today as we were in the past? And the answer is yes, but it depends on how you define productivity. We're remarkably innovative as an industry. In fact, we see 6 to 7% annual growth in the number of active compounds in R&D. And even in periods of down economic conditions, we still continue to see that tremendous innovation engine supported again by government and industry working in that kind of a symbiotic funding relationship. We can also look at productivity as defined by the number of approvals, and there you see it's a little bit more cyclical. Much of it depends on the volume and proportion of the total pipeline that is in later stage research. We saw one of our highest periods of approvals in 2017, but 2016 we saw one of our poorest periods, and a number of our colleagues in the financial services arena were really pointing to that as an indication that we're an industry that is really on the down slide here, and it's really not supported by the volume of activity, and again the number of approvals is really a very cyclical measure. But what we're not good at is the process of development and the process of running our clinical trials, and we all know that. But here are just some basic data points for you. We can look at the total amount of spending per year, which, as others noted, is rising at an even faster rate than even the number of compounds in development. It grows by about 8 or 9% annually. Revenue growth in our industry, although the total revenue is quite high today, is only growing by about 1 or 2%, just for global prescription revenue alone. We tend to look at the investment time horizon for a single successful drug, and I think you have all seen these statistics before, we estimate that about $2.6 is spent on a single successful drug over the development life of the product. When we capitalize those costs, they break down into three broad groups. There's the direct cost, which is only about a quarter of the total. 25 cents on that $2.6 billion are on each dollar for that $2.6 billion is actually going to support the direct costs. It's the cost of failures that is our largest driver of costs, and then there's a time-based component when we have to put our resources into a 10-year investment time horizon. And then we can look at our success rates specifically, and I know many of you have seen this data before, where we see our lowest success rates in our history at this time. Only 1 out of every 10 drugs that enters clinical testing will ultimately be approved, and you can actually see the wide variation in success rates by therapeutic area, where our oncologic candidates have the lowest success rates. We expect our overall success rates to continue to decline as we target more rare diseases and very, very small and highly targeted patient subpopulations. The overall cycle times are actually longer today than they were in the early 90s and mid-90s. So despite everything that we've applied to try to accelerate drug development, we're actually not improving our speed. Some have argued that, that the complexity of development has been essentially, its impact on speed has been controlled by so many of the solutions that we've applied to this enterprise, but we just have not been able to drive even greater levels of success. And then the key takeaway, of course, is the fact that these conditions are not sustainable. Given the very high cost to develop a successful drug, and today we see that the typical market for any drug introduced is now half the size that it was only 5 years ago, and the amount of time that a company can enjoy patent protection and an early entry into a market continues to consolidate as well. So for many analysts looking at the pharmaceutical industry, the return on that investment is far less attractive than many other sectors in our economy. And this is really creating, at the C-suite level, tremendous desire to find solutions that will really drive a higher level of speed and performance improvement. So these are essentially the conditions we've been talking about over the past 2 days. And these are very much the conditions that we see sponsor companies looking at with a really critical eye, trying to find solutions, many of them data-driven solutions, to really try to address these chronic conditions and reverse many of these characteristics, these operating conditions that we've been facing for over 20 years. The first is just the remarkable fragmentation in our operating environment. Fragmentation within many companies. Look at the largest companies today with 80 to 100,000 employees and a remarkable number of functions dispersed globally. Look at the investigative site community, where we're looking at over 35,000 unique investigators just supporting FDA-regulated clinical trials. So there's a tremendous amount of fragmentation. Among the CRO and vendor service providers, we also see so many solutions that are supported by a very small company that feeds into the broader contract services arena. So many of our collaborations and interactions, both within our companies and externally, are partitioned or separated. They're very carefully managed through the contracts that we establish, through a lot of the guidelines that we have to adhere to, and through a lot of the cultural ways that we typically treat our external providers or some of our colleagues in other functions, where we tend to silo and partition so much of the work that we do. Many of the solutions that we apply to development are siloed and are very point-based. They don't really address the broader continuum, as you've seen when we look at the overall cycle times, but instead they really address a very specific problem, like how fast we can close out a study from last patient, last visit to locking our database, or how quickly we can get a protocol reviewed and approved by an IRB. Complexity is driving a tremendous level of infeasibility, and Bill presented a lot of the data. We have a growing body of knowledge just documenting the hyper-complexity of our studies, and that, I think, is one of the root problems that we face today, especially when we apply such a fragmented landscape of resources that do not interact efficiently against it. We've talked a lot about the need for integration. The vast majority of work that we do and activities that we do are partitioned, as I mentioned, and we do not do a good job of integrating so many of the solutions that we're applying. And the data area is a very good example. If you look at the typical EDC system today, what it's primarily designed to do is to capture electronic case report form data. But as we introduce data from wearable devices and social media and real-world evidence, we have a tremendous challenge of actually trying to integrate all of these data points from diverse sources. And that's one clear place where we really struggle and where we do not have the expertise within most organizations to figure out how to do that. So we have to outsource again, even the integration challenge. And then we've talked about some of the other areas as well, the need to really better leverage existing infrastructure like the healthcare provider who is not playing an active role in enabling our patients to participate in clinical research today. All of these chronic conditions are not easily solved or addressed, but we believe that so much of the promise that's offered by the convergence of clinical research and clinical care can actually start to demonstrate the power of centralization and consolidation, where we can actually integrate very, very large and robust data sets. And we can use sophisticated and predictive analyses to actually help support an enterprise that is really supported by these chronic, inefficient, and high-cost operating conditions. So I just want to throw in a few extra data points for you to really give you a flavor for some of the consolidation that's occurring, as well as some of the other areas that I think are starting to help address or reflect attempts to address these conditions. Most of us don't realize that the amount of downsizing that's occurring among the largest pharma companies continues at a pretty rapid pace. For a while, there was a lot of headline gathering news about companies that were downsizing. Today, it's actually fairly quiet, but we see about 40,000 people with a high percentage coming out of R&D within large pharma today. And that, of course, is helping to drive the demand for outsourcing. And I showed you data earlier about the proliferation of small companies. Many of these undercapitalized companies, some of them operating out of a garage or a very small facility, and they turn to CROs, niche or specialty CROs, as well as a lot of the large full service to really become their clinical function. I talked to you about the fragmentation within the investigative site landscape, which is terribly frustrating and challenging, especially for many of the physicians and professionals in the room here who have been able to show that they can scale a site network, for example, or a site operation, whereas the vast majority of dedicated sites are not scaled, but continue to operate really as a standalone unit, or where we see a lot of the part-time investigators. And that's really the group that we see, where we see a tremendous amount of instability. And we continue to gather data that really documents the very high turnover rate of that particular investigator, the low volume, inexperienced investigator in particular. And as we move into conducting studies that target rare diseases and many of these highly focused and targeted patient populations, we're increasingly being forced to go into settings where we have to entice physicians who've never participated in a clinical trial. And we're seeing the competitive intensity for those physicians rising, but the level of familiarity and experience conducting and supporting clinical research is remarkably low, and really speaks to the need for industry to step up and find solutions that help train and support these assets so that they can continue to support a changing pipeline of drug development activity. This is just another way of looking at the data that Bill had shown you earlier. Now we're looking at a phase 3 pivotal trial across a 10-year time horizon. In each of the sampling frames, 2001 to 2005, 2011 to 2015, we're looking at anywhere between 8,000 and 10,000 protocols that we included in our analysis. And it really captures a lot of the points that Bill had mentioned, just the hyper complexity of our studies, but a few others I just want to point out. In both cases, the typical pivotal trial has one primary endpoint and maybe two key secondary endpoints, and the remainder are all supplementary, tertiary, exploratory. So much of the scope of our studies today is really not supporting the primary objectives of our research. A couple of other data points I'll point out for you. Look at the number of data points that are collected for a single phase 3 protocol. We're now approaching 1 million. And we see wide variation there. We've actually seen some phase 3 studies where we may be collecting 2 to 3 million data points. And Bill, I know you pointed out the percentage of that data that really isn't essential, that doesn't support our primary or key secondary endpoints. And that percentage is now approaching about a third. We have about 6 applications on average that we're using to actually collect this data today. That's average. But we've seen some studies that are really applying solutions in a very uncoordinated way in order to support the increased demand for data points. But here's part of the punchline. Complexity is inversely related with performance. So the more complex a protocol, the poorer the performance. And we have so many measures that document that. Here are a few additional ones. Now we're looking at the burden of identifying and starting up an investigative site. And we're looking at those 2 time periods again. It took, on average, about 26 weeks in that earlier time period. It's now approaching 30 weeks. And the level of variation around the mean is growing. It's expanding, which means that for each organization, they're seeing less consistent practice between their own studies and also as a comparison group when we look across multiple companies. And same with the data management arena. It captures a lot of the burden that we place on our sites today and on our data managers. The time between the patient's visit and when the patient's data is entered into the study database has increased from 6.9 days to 8 days. And again, the variation, that coefficient of variation is rising. And this was a shocking figure for us. The time to lock a database, it has grown despite all of the promise that we expected from EDC, ultimately helping us deliver a 1-week time period. It's actually now 36 days, and again, with very wide variation. So it's complexity that is at the heart of so much of this challenge and the volume and diversity of data that we're being forced to collect. So what we've touched on throughout the past couple days when we talk about bridging or joining these two completely separate domains are really a couple of key forces that are really driving the business and supporting that business imperative. The first is patient engagement itself, where we are really putting the patient at the heart now of what we need to support in order to make sure that clinical research is offered as a viable option, and what are all of the elements of that to ensure that the patient takes ownership for the success of our research, that it's convenient and easy for them to participate wherever they might be, where they have access to their data, and where we can actually have all stakeholders mobilize around supporting and enhancing the patient experience and patient engagement. And this has to be supported by a foundation of data and analytics, as we've been describing. And we heard case examples of a variety of places, from protocol design through site and patient identification, all the way through to some very exciting predictive analytics that really shave and save us a lot of time. And then the last area is the notion of the learning health environment, where we essentially make the final leap, where every data point we gather on a patient's response to a treatment, whether it's a commercially available treatment or an investigational treatment, all of that informs us about that patient's response to that treatment and how we need to make modifications to improve their response. And it also sheds insight to us into new opportunities for development areas as well as patterns in patient response that we can then apply to modify clinical practice. And then just the last area I'll leave you with is a really great study that ARC published, AHRQ, in 2017. And it just really captures the readiness of our health systems today and the volume of physicians who are all very deeply connected to the electronic health and medical record platforms to start to serve this vision and support this vision. And it's a very difficult transition, as we've been talking about, and getting our heads around it is a very tall order. But there is a really growing and powerful installed base of professionals in the research and the clinical care environment who are really being mobilized to support this vision going forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Craig, and then we'll have a chance for some discussion as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ken. That's always fascinating and informative, provocative content. Well, first off, I'd like to thank you for your patience and persistence. Ken and I were wondering if it would just be a private one-on-one conversation, and we're glad you're here. And I'd also like to echo Ken's remark earlier about Joe's regret at not being able to be here. The content that Joe is going to share, though, is based on some of the work at TransCelerate. Unfortunately, I'm on the oversight committee at TransCelerate, so I'm not just going to read Joe's slides. It is actually work that we've been doing together. So I will try to play the role of Joe for a few moments. So 58 million, that's the estimate of the number of people that would be needed to fill all of the trials that are posted on clinicaltrials.gov. That would be, just from here in the US, 1 out of 6 of us. Look around at your table and you can decide which one of you will volunteer. But yet we know that less than 1 in 5 sites will never enroll a single patient, and that our recruitment objectives are rarely met. And so some of the challenges, and much of this is based on Ken's work with SysGrip, some of the challenges that we know patients are confronting, fear and uncertainty is certainly among the first consistent challenge that patients articulate. It's an unfamiliar area. I would be concerned myself. Support systems, whether they're their own support at home or more often the support of their care team and their care providers. How will their treating physician respond to that opportunity? What feedback, support, and encouragement would they receive? Access to information. We've all heard and seen for ourselves some of the struggles of patients in finding information about clinical trials and managing and interpreting the information that's posted at the National Library of Medicine's clinicaltrials.gov. And then finally, the logistics. How will I get there? How do I take off from work to show up at these visits? But a common denominator of all of this is the assumption that people are even aware that clinical trials exist as an option. And so there's a cycle that one can envision. And if you start with that piece around awareness, you can then start to envision how these pieces start to fit together, of then being able to focus on the improvements around the information that's available for patients and their families and care team, the discussions that one would want to see taking place between patient and their physician around clinical trial participation. For those that have engaged, that social aspect around word of mouth, which ideally can then continue in terms of informing greater awareness. How do we leverage the people or the providers who've participated in research to continue to amplify that message and further increase awareness. And even just that nudge of a simple 1% and what kind of impact that would bring. And how many times in our own organizations would we get excited about a 1% improvement, thinking about the incredible impact that could make here. TransCelerate, you may be familiar with, it's going on its 6th year, is a nonprofit collaboration of around 20 biopharma companies working together around some common challenges in research and development with a heavy focus on clinical research. Within TransCelerate, we have a clinical research awareness, access, and also an information exchange initiative. And so together, these representing 3 of the more critical patient-facing initiatives that we've been driving within TransCelerate awareness, with a strong focus on awareness enabled through treating physicians, through healthcare providers, through the physician that the patients are seeing every day, or not every day, but every day that physician is seeing patients, where that physician is not an investigator in studies themselves. The vast majority of trials we're looking to enroll are looking to recruit patients who are already diagnosed with a condition. Most of them are looking to recruit patients who are already on an existing therapy. These patients have a treating physician. Somebody wrote that script for them. Somebody provided that diagnosis. And so many of the efforts that just focus exclusively on reaching out directly to patients and neglecting that existing relationship set that patient up to fail. We can't call those patient-centric just because we're posting ads directly to patients. Being patient-centric means making sure that we're able to stimulate that important conversation with their provider, if that's where the patient wants to go. Access to information, where an important area of improvement for us has been eyes-on registries like clinicaltrials.gov. And information exchange, how can we facilitate the right type of information during a trial that a patient's looking for. And so these initiatives that I'll point to have been very well supported by representatives from all the companies you see here, as well as important input with patients from day 0. And that's been largely enabled through a close collaboration with CISGRIP as a partner around patient input, patient advisory boards with each of these initiatives. In addition, TransCelerate has a very rich and long relationship with SCRS to ensure we have investigator site input into each of these. And for this initiative, engaged a new stakeholder, because while we've had long-standing ways to engage with investigators, and we've gotten much more sophisticated about engaging with patients, we really don't engage at all with treating physicians. And so we reached out to the AAFP, the Family Physicians Association. That was a personal coup for me because I'm married to a family physician, and she has never referred a single patient into a clinical trial. And I cannot say it's due to lack of awareness, because we do have dinner once in a while, and she is aware of where the other half of our income comes from. And then finally, our engagement with some of the existing registry platforms and with TransCelerate and engaging with NLM around ct.gov. And so there are 5 initiatives right now, many of which have some sort of asset, some sort of output. All of these are available on TransCelerate's website. They're all in the public domain. You can go there. You can pull up an individual initiative. You can click on their knowledge vault. There's no sign-in that's needed. These are just there and available. Some of them might ask you to enter information, but there's no payment, or in most cases, no registration needed. So the 5 that I'll call out here, one I'll actually show you an example of on the next slide. The Human Face of Clinical Research campaign is meant to face the HCPs. It's one of the first campaigns that we've had that's really targeting that physician who is not an investigator in research. And how do we start to raise better visibility and information about how those treating physicians can become more aware what tools and resources are available for them, and some of the value around participation for their patients. The second area of work that's cited here are what we've called clinical trial conversations. This is really about shared decision-making. How do we start to experiment with much richer models of shared decision-making when a patient and their treating physician are sitting together and exploring research as an option for them. And we're doing this together with Yale University and seeing what learnings, what impact we can start to measure and then start to amplify and further share. A third on here is around the site contact options paper. That's a pretty blasé title, and in general it's a pretty blasé topic, but it's actually pretty fundamental. As most of the folks in this room are aware, go to ct.gov and you're not going to see a lot of detailed site contact information. You might see there's an investigator site in Boston, Massachusetts. Well, if you didn't have an investigator site in Boston, Massachusetts, I'd be pretty surprised. But what you won't often see is a name and a phone number and email for that investigator site. This is really an opportunity across companies to start to dig deeper on that, to understand if that's important and what information we can start to surface and how. There are a lot of legacy reasons why that hasn't been there. Some used to be competitive, the perception by companies that this is a special investigator that only we've found, and we don't want other companies to be able to troll through ct.gov and see that we're working with Dr. Smith. Of course, that's kind of nonsensical. And in fact, through TransCelerate, we have an investigator registry. We can actually all see who's working with which investigator. We've embraced already that it's not some sort of intellectual property. And so there are other data privacy issues and concerns. We've heard some pretty negative stories as examples. For instance, pulling information maybe out of your some investigator database that a site that a company is keeping, and it turns out was a study coordinator's cell phone number. Well, you can imagine they would be none too pleased to have that posted on clinicaltrials.gov. The fourth area has gotten really great feedback. This is a wireframe around a registry of the future. This was done very closely with different patients as partners throughout, and it really pulls together what a site like ct.gov could or should look like in the future state. And it's not just based on, a bunch of Pfizer and other pharma people sitting around a table saying this is what we think it should look like. It was extremely well driven by a large number of patients that have been engaged, and we're really excited to see how that is now able to make some of this feel a little more real when we're engaging, whether it's with the NIH or with other stakeholders. And then finally, guidance paper and tools around information exchange. And some of this idea of what information exchange is may be as simple as thank you notes, right? Like this isn't, my wife teases me, I'm going to keep talking about her. She teases me that my business card says innovation, and yet by day I'm sending thank you notes to patients in our trials. How innovative is that? But we know that, some of these things we don't do systematically, and they're fundamental, right? How can you even have an engaged relationship with a patient as a participant if you're not even taking the time to say thanks for showing up? Well, I mentioned that there is a campaign that recently launched that's focused on the treating physicians. This is the campaign here, and I really have to give a hat tip to Joe as the driver of this campaign, working closely with Shields Friedman, who is a patient advocate himself, but also a fabulous photographer. And so this is taking a photojournalist style, taking advantage of social media. Take a look at one person closer on Facebook, on Twitter, follow it, participate, engage there. And it's just one start of trying to get more content out there to stimulate those conversations. Well, I'm done playing the role of Joe. And I can't do that very well because I'm a big fan of Joe. But I'm going to switch topics and just share a little bit of my own kind of end-of-day reflection on bridging and clinical research and clinical healthcare, coming from a pharma company, from a sponsor perspective. But first, just from a personal perspective, I love bridges. I live in the New York area, and I have to travel up to Connecticut a lot, up to Groton, the Pfizer site up there. And as a result, I go over the Tappan Zee Bridge probably once a month. And for those of you that have been going over the Tappan Zee at all over the last couple of years, there's been something amazing happening. Something that I'm surprised doesn't cause more car accidents as we're all craning our neck to see, but we're driving over the old Tappan Zee Bridge while they're building a brand new one right next to it. And this thing has gone up quick. I mean, no offense to the big dig up in Boston, Ken, but this thing went up pretty quickly, and it's really a magnificent sight. But you know, some of the things that really have sparked my thinking as I look at this is, you know, take a look in the bottom left there. You've got the old Tappan Zee Bridge and the new one next to it. And I think about this concept around bridging clinical research and healthcare. We have an old bridge, right? We've kind of been doing this for a while. As Ken mentioned earlier, the majority of our sites for our clinical trials are not standalone research sites. These are healthcare locations, whether academic or other types of healthcare settings. You know, it reminded me of how we, you guys have probably heard this before. What's the company that rents out the largest number of rooms per night but doesn't own a single hotel? It's Airbnb. What's the company that, you know, provides the most rides per day but doesn't own a single taxi? It's Uber. We've been in this sharing economy for quite a while because, well, outside of a couple of phase 1 sites, Pfizer doesn't own any investigator sites. We don't own patients. We rely on the same concept of a sharing economy, and that's really the legacy bridge that's been there that we can really build off of. But you know, as I think about this bridging thing, there was a quote that I'll attribute to Sharon Terry, who is the founder of the Genetic Alliance, and she shared this when the NIH's Precision Medicine Initiative was doing a lot of fact gathering in different communities. There was a large theme to this one particular meeting of how do we build bridges into these local communities around the country? How do we build bridges in so that more patients can participate in that large observational research study? All of us now, well, it's all of us, and it's active now, not all of us now. And one comment that Sharon had made was, you're thinking about bridges wrong. It's not about building bridges in, it's about building bridges out. You have to start by understanding what that local community actually wants, how they're thinking, what their research questions are, and you build the bridge out. And I think we have to think the same about building bridges. Many of us in this room are coming from the perspective of being researchers, investigators, research sponsors, CROs, technology enablers to the research process. I think it's important that, just as Sharon pointed out, that when thinking about local communities, you want to build bridges out, I think we have to think the same as we are thinking about how we build bridges, not into healthcare, but maybe out of healthcare. And that's where most of my energy has been focused in work that my team's been driving at Pfizer, which has been largely looking at integrated delivery networks and health systems in the US. And it was fascinating to see the data point that Ken shared a moment ago, that over half of physicians in the US are a part of a health system today. And yet, we still consistently engage those physicians as if they were all solo practitioners. We engage them not as Dr. Smith as a part of Geisinger, or Sutter, or Ochsner, or MedStar, any one of these large integrated delivery networks. We're engaging them as if they're a solo practitioner with just their own little universe of patients, and as if that EHR was just there for them without having the breadth of folks around them. And so I'm going to just call out 3 things that, as research sponsors or as CROs, we can do today. You can go home and, well, don't do it today, it's late. Go home, have dinner with your kids. But tomorrow, show up and take a look at, for the studies that you've got going on or that you've got planned, take another look at who you're calling an investigator in there. And take a look at where they're working and what system they're already a part of. Because you're already connected. You've already got that old Tappan Zee Bridge linking you there. Get on that bridge. Right? You probably have investigators that are at large integrated delivery networks in the US, but they're operating in your environment as if they were just a solo practitioner. Now, one thing you'll find is that not all health systems are equal, right? There are plenty that have little to no interest in research, and you'll have to start to learn a bit about each of those systems and how they may gravitate more towards the call to work together around research. But you'll also find that they're not created equal when it comes to their infrastructure. Some of these health systems in the US alone have been far more successful than others in implementing, say, a single connected EHR platform. So maybe it's all running on one EHR across multiple hospitals and inpatient and outpatient facilities, or they've invested in sort of solving that. Some of the health systems will have thousands of physicians aligned under a single medical group to drive their incentives and behaviors. Look for how you can take advantage of that. Amy spoke a little bit with the panel with Becky yesterday, but how can you leverage that existing health information technology investment and infrastructure to start to experiment with some of those efficiency opportunities in your trials today? Again, you already have probably some of those physicians as investigators in your studies right now or later this year. And so engage with them and start to find out if your investigator even knows where the health informatics department is. And then start to engage, because very often those physicians who are your investigators, they may not even know what opportunities are available. How many times have I heard from a doctor in a large health system, oh, we can't search our EHR to do that. Of course you can. You just don't know the people in your own system that do that every single day. Help them to make those connections and see how you can start to leverage that infrastructure in those trials today, whether it be experiments around patient identification straight through to electronically sourcing some data. Maybe you want to parallel source, right? So you've already invested in EDC, you're using it for the trial anyway. Why don't you start to see if you can electronically source some data in that trial in parallel and at least start to build that bridge. Keep in mind from that prior picture that when a bridge only has one column built, there's not a lot of value that you're going to get out of that bridge yet, right? But you got to start somewhere, and that's as easy a place to start as anyone. And then finally, if you do have those physicians already in your trial and they're part of a large health system, how can you work with them to stimulate more participation, not just within their own practice and the patients they know, but across that health system in general? How can you help them not only to search their EHR, but to start to work with them across that system and how they can try to actually reach those patients? I think it was on the last panel, it was Deirdre who mentioned how many times we can see that patients exist, but we don't have a way to reach them. Well, a health system has permission to contact their own patients. Even if they're not, the patients of Dr. Smith, some health systems are very comfortable reaching out to that patient on behalf of their health system. And in other cases, if it has to go through their treating doc, well, they're employed by that health system. Right? So the pieces are there for you, and you don't have to wait for an entire bridge to get built. You just have to start putting up those columns, believing in that longer term play, that eventually this bridge is going to be running, but if I don't start building, it's never going to get there. I'm going to stop there, and hopefully we can see if that's enough to spark a little discussion and conversation. Thanks.
Ken, thank you. It's always nice to come to a meeting like this and find out that what my children have been telling me for all these years is correct. I am a dinosaur. As an owner of 2 dedicated research sites, I look forward to the meteor coming over my shoulder any minute now. 2 sort of conflicting things that we've heard. In the CRO panel, we heard that change has to come from the C-suite, but it's not really being communicated from there. And one of your comments early on is the C-suite gets this, and they're trying to drive change. Why are we not feeling that there is change coming? Craig, from your side, Is that C-suite involved? Do they perceive that change needs to happen on the process side of what we're doing? Excuse me. Or are we just talking past each other with a lot of this stuff?
So it's a great question. The quick answer is that conceptually, the C-suite gets it. It's really at the executional level where we hit all the snags, and that's actually a level that the C-suite is not really close to as well. I think Deirdre even pointed out just examples. As you start to really break apart the concept and all of the steps that have to take place in order for the concept to be realized, that's where we hit so many of the snags and the bumps along the way.
I would agree. I think honestly, I think it's with respect to other comments earlier today, I think it's short-sighted to believe that the C-suite at Pharma is unaware of meteoric shifts that are taking place right now, just as the C-suite and CROs are very aware. I think that whether it's a CRO, a pharma company, or the FDA, each of these are complex organizations where the executives, the leadership, may certainly see certain things, but it is sometimes a very different challenge to make sure that your culture is aligned to adapt around that change. Just as there are engagements I know happen every day with CROs trying to convince a pharma sponsor to take a certain approach, I can tell you that there are CRO teams that are equally reticent at the study team level, just as there are regulators that can share impassioned stories of why they would support this. There are reviewers in individual divisions that may have the same reticence. Change is hard, and it is top-down, but as we know, culture is it is a top-down process, but it also is bottom-up concurrently for it to work. If we're not hitting on culture, it's not going to fly. And I have to share, I was sharing this with Ken at lunch. I've had my own learnings, even just in the past year, about trying to make that case with the C-suite at my own company. And I can tell you that fear tactics don't do it. Somebody was mentioning earlier we need to be scared. Pharma CEOs and executives are scared of plenty of things. Now you're just throwing one more burden on their lap, right? They want to know action and path forward. And so that's why I would say take to heart the opportunity to take action now. Lead by example. Show people the path and the actions that they can take, and take those to heart yourself. Because that's what I believe the C-suite needs to see, is that there are actual actions that you can put in front of them rather than just pointing at the meteor that's coming.
So Ken, I'm glad you talked about 50% of physicians are part of the systems. The slide I had yesterday based on CMS projections was 60% by 2019, and then complete elimination of private practice or small entrepreneur type practices by like 2038 or something along those lines. And that's basically how the reimbursement is structured at this point. Your CMS increase is 0.5% per year. Well, healthcare inflation is 6%. So the math is on the wall. I almost had the question last session, but I'm glad that you brought it up, Craig, on the business aspect of this. I think the Vernova slide had the little concentric circles. We've talked for a couple of days about, get to the physician, get to the physicians. But the writing's on the wall. Physicians aren't in control of their practices. They're not the practice operators that they are. It's run by sophisticated business people with formulas, projections, and things along those lines. And you have to make the business case to bring research in. When you say, we need you to hire a research coordinator and you're going to maybe recruit some patients and we're going to pay you, but we want to pay you Medicare rates because that's fair market value, but we only want to do it once a quarter and we're going to hold back 10% until 3 years later. Okay, so let me get this straight. I'm going to turn away higher paying patients so I can get lower paying patients, do more work for them for less money? Let me think about that. We want you to create this room. We need a dedicated office for your research arena. Well, that's cool, but last month I refer about 30 to 40 patients away for DEXA scans a month. I should buy a DEXA scan machine and put it in that room for patients I already have. We referred away 30 Endocrinology consults. Well, let's hire an endocrinologist. We, already have all these cancer patients. Let's hire a genetic counselor so we can have revenue. So you're not just competing with just getting the doctors and the attention. There's all sorts of other things in the healthcare ecosystem. So, the equivalent that I've given is when pharma builds that bridge out or in or whichever way, whether it's one way, hopefully it's two-way, that it's kind of the initial of, or the impression of the Iraq. You're not come in and welcome as liberators and have flowers thrown at you. You're another business opportunity amongst many others, and we have to make the business case in that area to get the incentives aligned for the physicians and everybody else. That's just my comment.
Yeah, and I'll just echo it, David. I couldn't agree more, and I think it is the business case, and we can really point to some of the economics and some of the inefficient and poor performance as the greatest impetus behind actually implementing something innovative or new. One of the challenges we face is every organization is open to this, but the way we pilot initiatives, we don't really measure its true impact. And as a result, we often throw out an innovation, assuming it can't deliver the kind of economic or efficiency-related outcome, because we assume it's just failed, when in fact we really never gave it the appropriate chance and we didn't measure it properly. So that's a part of the challenge we're facing now. Even with some of the patient-centric initiatives that many companies are experimenting with, they're only experimenting on a few of the sites in a multi-center study, or they're only implementing it on a pilot initiative that can't be generalized to other studies in their portfolio. So for this convergence to take place, we're going to really have to look for case examples, real examples that can be generalized, and where we try to do as much as possible to make the compelling case to continue to support them.
I think this theme of the freakonomics of clinical research and aligning those economic incentives is tremendous. And that, to me, embodies building that bridge out. Because if the C-suite at a health system believes in that model, believes in those incentives, they'll build the bridge. You don't have to. You just have to worry about the connection back to land on your side. And, when we years ago, when we were designing this first virtual trial, we had a centralized investigator site, and we needed patients to get a physical exam, and so they were getting a physical exam from their treating physician that we were paying fair market value, and that treating physician wasn't on the 1572. And it wasn't until after it started that we actually picked up our heads and said, oh, wait a minute. There's opportunity for treating physicians to support the research process without being an investigator. Because today, we're giving folks yesterday, we're giving folks just two choices. Send me your patients, or be a PI. And quite honestly, neither of those are particularly appealing. So now, today in 2018, there's, I think, a true renaissance of entrepreneurs and very interesting companies that are challenging that space and showing that there is value and opportunity for a third role of a physician to be engaged as a participant in research without being an investigator or sub-investigator on a 1572. And likewise, at a health system level, the data points that I thought were very exciting around the financial incentives at the health system level were some of the work that Lilly and the legacy PMG research did together with Wilmington Health. And if you haven't seen that, it's searchable online, or let me know. I don't know if anyone from Lilly is left here at this time, but it's great work, because they at least started to show that at Wilmington Health in North Carolina, that the patients in their health system who were in research studies were associated with better outcomes at a lower cost of care with higher patient satisfaction. And that wasn't directly attributable to the mechanism of the drug that was being tested. Right? An outpatient study had lower inpatient costs, as an example, for those patients during the time they were in the trial. those types of data are what you need to be able to show leaders at a health system that, you know what, this is actually good for you and your patient and the research environment. So I think you're asking the right questions.
Yeah, so when you look at the innovation, the things that keep us in homeostasis, you have the regulatory, you have the technology, or regulatory limitations, technology limitations, and economic and operational reality limitations. And you have to have all three lined up because you get too advanced and the other third one's going to pull it back. So I think we're at a state where the regulatory is there and the technology is there. I think it's just purely the economics
The operational, the process.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. Part of the issue is networking with people, which takes time and effort. When I registered for this conference, I asked if there was a list of everyone with their information. Now, I've met a few people here, but there are more than 100 people who've come. If I want to reach someone, or reach someone in Boston or something like that, it's not that easy. It would be easier if I had their email and phone number. And they told me, no, we can't give you that. Now, maybe I'm ignorant, but is it possible to get a list of everyone who attended and their information so that if you have the thought, well, maybe I'll call them or I'll send them an email, one could do it without a lot of pain and suffering?
I think the conference organizers would be happy to do that. And to your point, I think we've all recognized that the networking here is just so valuable. So it's a great point.
I would add, though, that take advantage of. I mean, I can tell you how many LinkedIn connection requests I've gotten in the last 24 hours from people in this room, and so take advantage of some of the technology for networking as well. Not everybody will be there, but it is a way to at least go through and see if there were people that you heard at the podium that you'd like to connect with, and many of them may be there as well. Just as a general networking opportunity. I will answer emails that I get through LinkedIn, but I'm brutally honest. So, more so than I am for my Pfizer.com email account.
Greg, I'm glad you brought up the PMG white paper. To me, that is the gold mine. That's what we should all be doing more of. And I just was wondering, companies like Mayo and Duke who are doing this, are they? How do you measure? So, better patient outcomes, higher patient satisfaction, reduced costs for patients and payers. More engaged physicians, these are all great things. How are they measuring it? Like better outcomes, how do you measure that with coding and the results and tie it back to the participation in a trial? Like how is that being done? Because that's where the concrete evidence is. And I think it's real, but it's how do we actually measure that, which I'm looking for more insight on.
I have to say, in some cases, it can be a little more straightforward than others. But if you take that outcomes question, that's going to vary on a population-by-population basis. In the case with PMG, they took an example, for instance, of a study that recruited heavily among diabetics. And even though the drug's target effect wasn't around A1C levels, they showed an indication around A1C among patients who were in the trial. And that it didn't matter about your treatment assignment. Those were compared against patients who were just not in a trial. The cost data was, I think, a little more straightforward for them. But I think one of the challenges that I've heard in that space is that for most organizations, while they're good at getting that types of outcome data, they have to do it for a lot of different reasons at a health system level, that many health systems struggle to be able to connect when a specific patient is on or off of a trial, that their CTMS isn't necessarily attached that way to their EHR where they may get some of that other evidence. It was apparently a very manual process that Wilmington had to do for that one example. But the takeaway was that the measures that were looked at were ones that mattered to Jeff James, the CEO at Wilmington Health, right? He wanted triple aims to be an accountable care organization at the time under the health system that we still have in this country today, which meant to him that if he could show these triple aims of improved outcomes, lower cost, higher satisfaction, there's other revenue opportunities for him. And that, not to, misquote Jeff, the sentiment that he would have had to otherwise invest in case managers at his expense to get those types of outcomes, but clinical research participation for those patients was like a non-dilutive option. We offset the cost of the study coordinators just as a part of, the sponsor relationship, and they realized this other halo benefit when the patient's in the trial. I'd love to see more of that data generated, so if there are data geeks in the room that feel that their environment can better connect CTMS and EHR data, or you're in grad school and want to take that on as a challenge, let me know. Find me on LinkedIn.